This video comes with a content warning for mentions of abortion, homophobia, and transphobia. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello again. This is the first in a 4-part miniseries where I'll be responding to Jubilee's Middle Ground Liberal Christians versus Conservative Christians video. This response is split over several videos because otherwise it would have been well over an hour long. It takes only a minute to make a false or misleading theological assertion, but it takes a lot longer than that to provide the proper context and biblical arguments against such a position. I encourage you to see these videos as more of a reference work, providing some broad brushstrokes of the theological arguments against a number of conservative positions, which I will aim to elucidate further in future videos. I'll include timestamps so you can jump directly to particular issues and arguments as you desire. As usual, I'll be showing various clips from the original video in this discussion, but we'll also include a link to the original video in the comments below so you can ensure that I'm not taking anything out of context. Without further ado, let's begin with our first section on the prompt, "The Republican Party embodies Christian values better than the Democratic Party." Let's begin with the in favour camp's opening statements.
Step forward if you agree with the statement. The Republican Party embodies Christian values more than the Democratic Party.
I don't know a whole bunch about politics, but when I see like pro-life, things like that, I would have to just deduce from that Republican is more Christ-centered.
Right, I'm not talking about big government versus small government regulation. I'm talking about specifically pro-life, talking about education, public education of transgender. I'm talking about marriage.
To summarise their claims, they seem to assert that what it means for a given political party to better embody Christian values is to hold certain policies with respect to abortion, public education of transgenders, by which I assume they mean the teaching of the basics of gender identity and expression in schools, and marriage, by which I assume they mean issues of marriage equality, rather than just supporting marriage, as I don't believe any political party is advocating for abolishing the right to straight marriage. American subscribers can correct me in the comments if that is not the case. There are 2 issues to raise here. Firstly, at no point in his teaching does Jesus talk about abortion, or gender issues, or marriage equality. He does talk extensively about providing for the poor and the sick. As such, making the former the bedrock of your understanding of Christian values in politics, and not the latter, seems to present a very warped view of the Christ's political teachings. Secondly, it's striking that both of these conservative Christians make particular issues the centre of their understanding of Christian values in politics. They do not go to neighbourly love, to affirmation of Scripture, to personal virtue, to pacifism, generosity, or any of the other values which Scripture affirms. They go directly to key issues. What makes this so striking is that later in this very episode, Jason, the conservative here, will accuse the progressive Christians of making Christianity too issue-focused.
Well, I feel misrepresented because, like you said, you think it's about the issues like sexuality or social justice.
Yet, by his own reckoning, the political interpretation of Christian values is purely an issue-focused thing. This reveals a vein of hypocrisy which we will see played out again and again in the conservative positions. Now, let's hear the response from the against camp.
A very conservative, far-right church. I used to be a Trump supporter, although I'm not even a US citizen. But one thing that really hurt me and changed my perspective was how they talk about immigration and poor people. Like myself, I grew up in poverty, and Planned Parenthood is my PCP because they take Medicaid. But when I found out that my friends actually did a silent protest in front of Planned Parenthood, that really changed my perspective a lot. Like over 75% of people who get abortion are low income.
I, like you, have been in not poverty, but in situations where I couldn't afford health insurance. Universal health care is the most Christ-like thing I can imagine. It's full of compassion. It's saying, yeah, maybe you have to take this out of my pocket, but it's for the poor who can't afford it. I'm like, that's Jesus to me. I don't see what's going on there.
The progressive point here is basically correct, but their presentation is primarily in more feelings or general principle terms, so I think it is worth taking a moment to stress the strong biblical basis for the positions they espouse. With regards to poverty, I'm sure I do not need to point to you to the scriptures that demonstrate God's compassion to the poor. To quote just a few examples, we might look to Proverbs 31, verse 9, which states, "Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and the needy." Or we might look to Acts chapter 4, verses 34 to 35, where in the picture of a thriving church after the ascension of Christ we read, "There were no needy persons among them, for from time to time those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need." Likewise, there is a strong biblical basis for rejecting anti-immigrant rhetoric and positions, as we read in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." In other words, anyone who advocates for strong borders, or indeed for any legal distinction between native citizen and immigrant whatsoever, is directly going against the express will of God in this Levitical chapter. For this reason, it's clear that if our understanding of embodying Christian values is in any way based on Scripture, the Republican Party, especially under Trump, which made anti-immigrant standing one of its core tenets, is about as far from Christian values as it is possible to be.
In regards to abortion specifically, I do think that that is someone's future in there. And I think that the choice between if that future is played out or not is God's. And I take that from Psalms where it says that his eyes saw our substance being yet unformed, and he fashioned our days when yet there were none of them. And so the moment at conception when that baby exists, no matter how small they are, their whole future is lined up. And I know that sometimes circumstances on how those babies come about suck. And I've met someone that was a product of that. Okay, their biological father raped their mother, and she doesn't know who her biological father is. But I couldn't imagine life without her.
What about the mother that finds out that she's pregnant and she goes to the hospital and they tell her that it's a high-risk pregnancy and that if she does take the baby to term, that she runs the risk of giving birth and actually dying?
I think that in those circumstances, in those situations, I think that they should trust the Lord.
So what if the Lord tells them to have an abortion?
I'm just gonna have to say trust the Lord, and I'm not a woman. I will never be put in that place. So,
and I ask that because I have a friend that his daughter went through that, and he chose his daughter over the baby, and so they ended up having an abortion. And he was pro-life prior to that circumstance.
I mean, I would still trust God. I think if I was in that situation, I would pray with my husband and call on my church and my family. Let's come together and pray about this, and whatever God's will be done. If my life be taken, then I pray that this baby will be used and that he would give me the comfort and the peace to get through that situation.
There are a couple of points to raise here. Firstly, the Conservatives make something of a mantra of the phrase, trust God, but when pushed on what they mean by this, it seems pretty evident that they assume that trusting God means following their preconceived anti-abortion expectations, regardless of evidence or reason against this position. This bias is brought out particularly starkly when Kurt simply says,
"So what if the Lord tells them to have an abortion?"
I'm just gonna have to say trust the Lord.
Both Angel and Kiara refuse to engage with that possibility, and this shows a very dangerous attitude towards God. It seems that they have already decided that if God told them anything which did not fit with their existing worldview and biases, they would reject that as not of God. If you're only willing to listen to God if he is confirming what you already believe, you're not listening to God. You're listening only to yourself and making an idol of your own ideology. Worse still, not only are they demonstrating that they would hold this view irrespective of the will of God, but by holding this view, they are already raising their own ideology above the express will of God. What do I mean by this? Well, the Conservatives only rally a single Bible verse to support their position, Psalm 139, verse 16. Now, this passage and others do demonstrate God's love of his creation and his personal involvement in planning and crafting the lives of his children. But this in itself is not an argument against abortion. Nowhere in this passage, nor anywhere else in Scripture, does it say, "Thou shalt not abort thy offspring." Now, this in itself would not be a problem if the Bible never said anything positive about abortion either. There are many issues which the Bible neither says yes nor no to, and Christians aiming to live faithful lives must try to deduce what a biblical perspective on such issues would be, given what Scripture gives us. But abortion is not such an issue, because of the book of Numbers, chapter 5, verse 27, which says, "If she has made herself impure and been unfaithful to her husband, this will be the result. When she is made to drink the water that brings a curse and causes bitter suffering, it will enter her, her abdomen will swell, and her womb will miscarry, and she will become a curse." This water that brings a curse is clearly a method of inducing miscarriage, that is, a method of abortion. This, to my knowledge, is the only passage in all of Scripture which explicitly mentions abortion, and not only does this verse fail to condemn abortion, but it actively commands that abortions should be performed in certain circumstances, here in the case of marital infidelity. From this passage and others, we can conclude that the Bible is not pro-life, at least not in the pro-birth sense of supporting laws that would allow the state to force a pregnant woman to give birth against her will. As far as the Bible acknowledges abortion at all, it recognizes that it may be the preferable action in some cases, and indeed commands it in certain situations. Whether or not these commands are still binding on the modern Christian, it's impossible to conclude that a text which commands abortion in cases of infidelity would ever support legal action that would prevent abortion in these and other cases. Thus, the rabidly pro-birth position of the conservative is not just unfounded in Scripture, it is actively anti-biblical. This is the end of the first instalment of this response series. The second episode will concern the second statement in this debate, namely, LGBTQ+ couples should be allowed to get married in the church, where I'll provide theological and scriptural evidence that the conservative homophobic position is based in abusing Scripture and ignoring both historical and wider textual contexts. Till next time, folks, grace and peace.